Thomas, good afternoon, and thank you for joining. And everybody, thank you for being here with me and with us in this new chapter of Earth Matters. I'm very pleased that this is actually going to be a new interview that we'll be conducting with a really important person that I wanted to introduce you to. So this is Thomas Hill, and I will introduce him very briefly. But first of all, welcome, Thomas, and thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I know a really important person is not how I would describe myself, but thank you.
You are too many, believe me. He has become a top voice on LinkedIn. He shares really incredible and valuable content when it comes to humanitarian work and when it comes to human rights activism as well. So let me just read you a brief introduction about Thomas. So Thomas' journey began with teaching English as a foreign language instructor volunteer with the Peace Corps in Yaroslav region, in the Russian Federation, and assuming leadership roles in international development and humanitarian assistance. Over the 24 last years, he has held pivotal positions such as executive director at the International Rescue Committee in the greater Los Angeles area, and as a country director in challenging contexts, including the Chechen Republic and Palestinian territory. His career highlights include serving as an operations manager at the International Federation of the Red Cross and the Red Cross Crescent Society's field programs at Mercy Corps in Syria, which is pretty big, and as a country director for the Norwegian Refugee Council in Nigeria, which is his current role. Thomas oversees operations supporting displaced persons and hosts communities with a team of, that's a lot of people, 350 members and an annual budget of $25 million. So like I said, Thomas, he works for the Norwegian Refugee Council, which is one of the world's leading non-governmental organizations working on humanitarian issues. I created quite a few questions that I feel and I believe that loads of people around humanitarians, aspiring humanitarians, have been posing for you to actually address. So like I said, you have become quite a leading person in that field. So let's start with the first question, which is an opening question. Could you share with us some of your most memorable experiences as a humanitarian, both positive and challenging, and that have significantly shaped your career and perspective?
Sure, yeah, thanks. It's nice to be here. Congratulations on the podcast. I hope it continues to grow. Very exciting to have a chance to speak a little bit. I would note at the beginning that I'm a much better writer and speaker, which is why I enjoy posting on LinkedIn. I actually studied English, so it's a bit
very
of a hobby.
natural interview, so please feel very comfortable.
Thank you. But yeah, so I mean, in terms of your question, I've been involved with humanitarian work for quite a long time now. And I think one thing that I find that has been interesting in my career is I've managed to go back and forth between working internationally and working at home. And I've managed to work with refugees overseas and refugees in the United States. And I've managed to work on humanitarian response overseas, but humanitarian response in like the Los Angeles area. And so in terms of learning, like the humanitarian world is made up of lots of different people, right? With lots of different backgrounds. So there's no one version of a humanitarian worker. But oftentimes what we do see is sometimes when you have expats overseas, they may not have worked domestically. And so for me, I think one of the most rewarding experiences I had was to do humanitarian work in Los Angeles, right? Work with communities impacted by fires, by poverty, by COVID, different things. It really changed my perspective on what it means to be a humanitarian. So that was a good one. Some of the negative stuff, like I've had situations where I've had death threats and I've had to leave countries, and I've seen like dead bodies and things like that. So there's a lot of different negativities out there that you can engage with. But I think even from those, you learn about yourself.
Wow.
But yeah, at the end of the day, like coming away with an appreciation of being able to help people and spend your life doing that, like that's a good thing. So.
It is actually crazy that you have said that you have even received that threats, knowing that you are a humanitarian, a person who actually comes to help communities. We will get to that question actually below, which is about being a human rights activist or being a humanitarian. Because
Sure.
to me it's somehow, it's not two different things, but it comes across as two different things. So when you talk about death threats and yeah, it poses
Yeah.
a question, but I will not ask it right now. Maybe we can leave it for another, hopefully another session, because and also obviously if you are comfortable talking about that experience a little bit more in detail. So the next question will be, in your role as a director for the Norwegian Refugee Council, and maybe as well from your previous roles as well, how have these experiences influenced your approach leading humanitarian efforts and guiding your team through complex challenges?
Yeah, it's a good question. I thought about that one before the interview, and so as you mentioned, like in my biography, I started actually as a volunteer. Originally I thought I was going to be an English teacher, and after college in the United States, I went into what's called the Peace Corps. It's a U.S. government program where you volunteer overseas for a couple of years, get to know a community. And I was an English teacher, right? So I did that, and I found out I was really bad at teaching. Like it's really, really hard, right? But I really enjoyed working with nonprofits in the community I was in, and so I took that and pushed it forward to a career. And from there, like I haven't been a director my whole career, right? And so as I've gotten more and more responsibility, I guess, over the years, just try to maintain that connection to who I was and where I started, and remembering what I wanted, right? And I think a big part of what influenced me was after the Peace Corps, when I came back to the US, it took me 2.5 years to get my first real development job back overseas. And so having that experience where like I just really wanted, to be engaged with humanitarian development work and couldn't be, I think has led me to really put people at the center of my approach to management, and sort of understanding of a human-centered experience in life, right? Empathetic to people. So
Mm,
also just thinking about like when I was when I was starting out, what did I want? And then how can you continue to apply that throughout your leadership journey?
mm. So overall, would you say it has been a very fulfilling and yeah, a positive experience working as a director and having so many people under you, actually?
Yeah, for the most part, I love it. I really enjoy, like some people have a real problem being like, in charge of stuff, don't feel comfortable being a boss, but I enjoy being able to set direction and look at strategy and consider vision and try to help other people grow. And I think more and more the sort of mentoring and coaching and helping other people like get into the industry has really just become more and more enjoyable as I have more sort of leadership space and leadership opportunities. So,
That is
but yeah, I mean, it comes with its own problems too, right? But that's life.
that is actually the role of a leader, to be a mentor. There have been many posts around and information around from people like Simon Sinek, um, who
Mm.
talks about the difference between management and leadership. And management is just a person who manages, and that's it. But a leader is a person who actually leads and a mentor and helps other people get to where they want to get. So actually, thank you for being that type of person indeed.
Thanks.
So
Yeah, I think part of the challenge in any organization is because oftentimes people are good at one or the other, right? And they're expected to do both, and there's not really enough attention paid to helping people become good managers and good leaders, or to be one or the other, right? They don't necessarily always have to go together. So
so the next question will be, reflecting on your journey, how do you balance, this is a good one, I think. How do you balance the emotional toll of humanitarian work with maintaining resilience and effectiveness in your leadership role, but also, if I may add, in your own personal life as well? It's very important.
sure. Yeah, that could be a whole episode, I think, right? I mean, that touches on everything from burnout to just management to professionalism. But I would say for myself, like one thing I've learned over time is to understand what my sort of indications of stress are. Once you kind of know yourself, like you can learn how to start managing yourself, right? But before that, I think most people go through this experience as they develop as a professional. You start out kind of wanting to be full on and in there and, giving 150% all the time. And that leads to burnout in most people. And so it did for me as well. And then I think taking away from that lesson and learning, okay, when I start feeling like this, I need to pull back. When I start feeling like this, I need to take vacation. When I start feeling like that, then I need to find a different job. Right. And so finding those sort of indicators for yourself is really important as a professional. I don't really know if that answers the question specifically, but
It
in
does.
terms of like the practical aspect of it, there's that. But then there's also the coming to terms with what you want to do with your life is a big part of it as well. And I think that's one that challenges people.
Mm.
Um, and what's been really interesting as being sort of a middle-aged dude, as I read these like self-help books that are like, oh, you know, as you go into your 40s and 50s, like you really should start thinking about giving back to society. Don't
Mm.
focus so much on making money. I'm like, yeah, I've never, I don't have that problem. You know, I've never made much money, but I also like, I'm able to focus on having a life where I've helped people. So
That's very good.
yeah, finding that balance is good. Plus, I have kids too, so I don't really have a choice. Like I have to find balance.
Yes, especially if you want to have a family as well. So you need to be sure that you can, it's not just time wise, but it's also mental health wise as well, that you are mentally fit, you know, to actually have a family. Because if you have traumas that are unprocessed, given, for example, what you mentioned earlier, that you have seen things that nobody should see or experience things that nobody should experience, those things, they mark you and they create some sort of trauma. So it is
Mhm.
absolutely important for people like yourself, people who work in the front line, to ensure that their mental health is well checked indeed. So they can, you know, you have to put the mask on first before helping others. So I think, yeah,
Yeah,
it
it's
makes,
a good way to
yeah,
put it.
yeah, it makes total sense what you say now. Yeah,
Yeah.
very helpful. Thank you so much. So we are going to move now on to the next part of this session, which is sector analysis and improvement. So this is the part where we actually analyze and become a bit accountable as well. How can one become a humanitarian these days, and how elitist would you say the humanitarian sector has become?
Um, I don't know that I would use that word, but I do think in some people's experience, that's probably pretty accurate, right? And I think, kind of as I said earlier, there's no one humanitarian worker, there's no one humanitarian experience, right? And there's a lot of different ways to go about your career and approaching the humanitarian sector. And I think that in some entry points, there's definitely much more attention paid to like who you are, what you've done, like who you know, these kinds of things, right? And then there are other situations where it's all hands on deck, get people in here who are willing to help. And then, you know, if you compare like where you are, what agency you're trying to work with, what emergency you're trying to respond to, or, you know, are you not responding to an emergency? Maybe you're working on longer term issues around human rights and advocacy and, you know, things that just have like their own culture as well within the industry. So I think there is, you know, much like any industry, like there are insiders and outsiders, right? You got to break through that wall. And that for anyone who's read like the stuff I put on LinkedIn, a lot of that is about getting to know people and building a network and doing some of that work. In terms of the bar for entry, I do think, I wouldn't call it elite, but I would say over the years, the term that people use is professionalized. And what I've seen over my couple of decades in aid is, you know, there used to not be that many like master's degrees in humanitarian aid or disaster management, right? And now it's become this thing where it's like, well, everyone has one of those, everyone speaks 6 languages, like particularly in certain career paths, the bar to entry has become very, very high. Whereas, you know, I studied poetry in college, right? So like, I didn't have that academic background per se.
Mhm.
Um, but I do think, again, it depends on who you're talking about, right? Like if we're talking about you or me sitting in London or sitting in Los Angeles versus, you know, someone with applicable experience sitting in Lebanon or sitting in Palestine or sitting in Sudan today, you know, your entry point is going to be much different, right? So I think it's also important as we consider that to think about the things that are actually happening in our world as humanitarians and where you would have added value. And I think if you pull away from, you know, like if you want to be, for example, someone who wears a black, you know, sort of cashmere jacket in Washington, D.C. and does policy work, it's a very different world than if you're, you know, working with WFP in Gaza today, right? So again, one perspective to say elitist, another perspective to say go where you're actually needed.
Right now, the situation in Palestine, it's dire, and not everyone can go because of what is very obvious. Even humanitarians are being targeted. So we're talking now about security issues, and safety as well. But would you say that in those settings, those different settings, it will be less difficult in countries in conflict, because obviously people will be a little bit more deterred when there are security and safety issues?
Kind of a hard balance, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that question also asks who you are. And so it implies that you're looking for an expatriate role overseas. And if that's the case, then yeah, there are ways to sort of game the system and find a more likely opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I would say in Palestine is a great example, actually. Palestine humanitarian programs have been going on for decades. There are many, many, many highly qualified Palestinian aid workers, right? Palestinian Red Crescent Society does amazing work. There are NGOs I worked with for NRC and Save the Children, who are local, agencies that have been around for decades, and do amazing work as well, right? So it's within all of that, like what are your relevant skills and where are they needed? And so going into a place where all of those amazing aid workers may have lost their family and their homes, right? Then yeah, they're going to need more help than they will,
They're
sitting in,
less.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But on a normal day, 3 years ago, before the current escalation, like, a lot of the aid needs in the aid industry in Palestine on a day-to-day basis were taken care of.
Mm-hmm.
So it's looking at it saying, what do you want to do? Where can you add value? And then, also where are you willing to go? And yeah, but again, I mean, in terms of finding an entry point, yes, like if you're looking for an expatriate role and you're coming from someplace like the US or the UK, then, one way to increase your chances is to go to a place that fewer people are interested in going. So
Even when I know many people will be thinking right now, oh my God, this is my chance. I think it's very important that it's a personal call that I want to make for the sake of the people who are assisted. It's not everybody, it's emotionally qualified to be
yeah,
in those settings. And I think whilst workforce is very necessary in those situations, those settings like Sudan, and Palestine, I think we will get to that point actually later on, but it is very important that during the hiring process, we look into aspects such as community engagement and emotional intelligence. These are really two crucial things more than any master's degree. Because and obviously you need to be able and capable of doing anything and everything that you can, because it's very physical as well. You have to do a lot of physical work. And I think that to me, that could be the three keys. That will be my triangle for when hiring a person for a very high conflict context. Resilience, actually, I'm gonna do a square now. So, but that's part of emotional intelligence as well.
yeah.
So yeah, let's move on to the next question, which is, in a world increasingly facing humanitarian crisis like the one we are living in, why are some institutions experiencing some high level of bureaucracy when it comes to hiring staff? And that question I have to explain myself. I always read Glassdoor, and Glassdoor is, as you know, it's where everybody do the checks and reviews about companies and organizations. And there are many organizations that I cannot obviously mention here that don't have very good reviews from previous employees. And the very common word is bureaucracy. So this is where I got this question from.
So I would say it extends beyond hiring. There's a lot of bureaucracy in almost everything. And it's a pretty common complaint actually in most agencies and most places I've worked and most places I've heard of people working. Some of it comes from, like, it's multifaceted, right? There's not like one reason as to why there's more bureaucracy than others. In terms of hiring specifically, I mean, I think for people to find a job anywhere is very hard, right? Particularly with modern systems. People regularly put in 150 job applications before they get an interview. regardless of the industry, right? Whether it's humanitarian or software development or whatever it might be. So that's one. There's just a lot of steps now. But I don't think getting a job has ever been very easy. Like even before, LinkedIn and all this stuff. I mean, I assume it was very similar 40 years ago. Like it's not easy to get a job. In terms of overall bureaucracy, there's a really great book that I like a lot. It's called The Idealist Survival Kit. And it specifically talks to that. It looks over the psychology of aid workers in both domestic and international settings and gives like scientific, in terms of social science, evidence that bureaucracy is the leading cause of burnout amongst aid workers globally, right? And so you see this in particular, like people want to be out in the field, helping at sites that are being managed or camps that are, being supported, but they have to do reports, right? Like, so there's all this, like, there's these, like, all these processes involved in getting assistance to people. A lot of that is around accountability. Like, as things have gotten bigger, as systems have gotten more complex, there are more levels of accountability. I think as things have professionalized, that just a lot of systems have been created to justify some of the jobs that we have, honestly. Like, if you hire someone, they're going to create work, right? Like that's how it works. And then also as things like get built, oftentimes we don't take away other things. So you'll end up in a situation where you've got like 12 layers of compliance or risk management on top of an activity that doesn't need to be there, right? It's just like overboard. So, but yeah, I would say also, I mean, there's a greater understanding and a greater focus on things like aid diversion and risk management. And so systems are more complex in a lot of ways. And then, in terms of the aid industry trying to answer some of the scandals and challenges that it's had over the years, things like, sexual exploitation and abuse, for example, have also created a need to have systems that are much more thorough, right? And much more, or at least an attempt to try to screen for some of the things or the negative things that come through the industry as well. So in hiring particularly, I mean, I've had some hiring processes where I've had like 6 interviews, a background check, multiple references, and a psychology test, so like, and all of these are things meant to like help understand if you fit in the culture, but also to make sure that you're not like, someone who's running from something negative at another place. So yeah, there's lots of different reasons. It's a big question, but it's definitely one of the biggest challenges in the aid world.
So it will be very interesting to know in terms of statistics, how often do you get profiles that seem to be really high level profiles, but then eventually they don't have the competency psychologically and emotionally to actually be a good fit for the role. So that can be another question that we can discuss at some other point. Yeah. So thank you so much for that. We're going to move on now to our next stage, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is DEI. So the first question in this section, it's first of all, it comes with a long background, which is the humanitarian sector has a long history that is often intertwined with colonial legacies. This history has resulted in power imbalances, where aid workers from more privileged backgrounds often hold significant influence over the communities they serve. This dynamic can perpetuate inequalities and hinder the development of genuinely collaborative and respectful aid practices. Addressing these historical power imbalances is crucial for creating a more equitable and effective humanitarian sector. And the question comes here. How can the humanitarian sector move past the colonial history of aid and address the inherent privileges many aid workers wield?
Yeah, and so, I mean, that could be an entire episode, right? That question by itself. And there's a lot of really amazing thinkers on that question, actually, in the aid world. Some people have talked about how to integrate changes into the current system, and some people have talked about how to just throw it out and start over again. It's like some really, really interesting stuff, particularly around the Center for Humanitarian Leadership in the UK. And they have someone they work with pretty frequently. You'll see on DevX, Themrise Khan. Really, really interesting thinking on stuff. But yeah, so I mean, aid is impacted by colonialism. Yes, I mean, it started as a political system, and it's still very much impacted by politics of, power imbalance and countries trying to do right, for past wrongs, but also wanting to influence current thinking. And there's why you can see things like in Nigeria, a lot of external interests that are expressed through the aid system, right? Because it's part of a package that a country might be giving. So that continues, like those politics continue. And I think it's pretty realistic to expect that they always will continue. There are very few governments in the world who are purely humanitarian. Governments are by nature political. So I think there's one accepting that reality, right? And then within that, as humanitarians, adhering to our principles and working from that perspective and making sure that we try to stay outside the politics of it insofar as we can. But yeah, I mean, I think that colonialism has impacted a lot of different things in the world, not just aid. I'm coming from the United States. The history of colonialism is, still quite prevalent in almost everyday discussion. So there's that. Yeah. I do think in my time involved with aid, like things have changed and there have been some positive improvements, particularly when you look at the face of leadership today and you look at the extent to which, local partners are engaged, and you look to the extent to which, expatriate employees are pulled in versus national staff being hired. So there are intentional approaches to fixing some of the power imbalances and making sure that local voices are more heard, right, and have more ownership over the entire response. That said, I mean, it's not, it hasn't fundamentally changed, right? It's not like things have fundamentally changed since the 60s, since post World War II. Like the system's still pretty similar. It's, global North countries come in, they give money, NGOs get the money, spend the money. So there have been some positive developments, but yeah, there's not been a whole sector change. But yeah, in terms of
how can the humanitarian sector move past that colonial history? So how do
can it
we,
move past it completely? Yeah.
yeah, how do we move, people? Do we become a movement? How do we
Yeah.
mean it?
Yeah, I mean, some of the thinking has been done on how things could change, and you do see that in some organizations that have stood up. And it's an interesting, and again, why it could be an entire episode by itself. When you look at organizations like BRAC, for example, which is, started in Bangladesh and has become a major global player, to what extent is that revolutionary, or to what extent is that they just become another player, right? And as things become international, you do get more voices involved, right? If you look at the UN, for example, is incredibly global, incredibly diverse. To what extent are they saying anything that's outside the system? Like, it's not so much, right? It's again, it's impacted by politics, it's impacted by money. So yeah, I don't think there's going to be one moment where like everything is fixed. I think being intentional about it, having people like you asking these questions, having managers who are willing to really like put the money that they're getting into, helping local partners take lead on things and helping nationalize, expatriate roles, and like people who might want to be expats actually saying, I'm gonna fundraise at home because that's our strength, right? And foregoing some of those situations where the power dynamic propagates itself. But yeah, I mean, for my part, I'm really just trying to be intentional and like at least not hurt things. But am I succeeding? I don't know either. So
You
yeah.
might be. You might be. It definitely opens up many new questions, and I think at the end of this interview, I'm gonna end up sending you another invitation for another session because it's really, really interesting the points that you are making here. And it's interesting because we are talking about ways to tackle this colonization mentality. And
Mm.
yes, I mean, I do see many roles that they are only hiring nationals, which is it's great. Um, but it's so complicated because Yes, I mean, obviously, national people need to be at the front, and they have to be the first people actually engaging in their own community. But when we have situations like in Palestine right now, where the actual
Mhm.
people are being killed, there is a very little chance for anyone, and not just killed, but the trauma they are experiencing as well. You cannot, these people don't have a mask right now on to help other people. So this is
Sure.
going to inevitably call for external help, which might endanger, of course, the country once again when it comes to colonialism, which is a long standing um, battle that obviously
And that drives a really deep, long discussion, right? Because the Israeli-Palestinian conflict dives into the questions of colonialism going
yeah,
back a very long, very, very
yeah,
long time.
we
And
definitely
so in terms of where the conflict is originating, how it's being managed, how the response is being dealt with, like you can go into a lot of different points. Um,
yeah.
but
Mm,
yeah, also in terms of relief, emergency response, I think there is a global system for that that is slightly different from the conversation around colonialism and aid. When you look at long-term entrenched developmental issues, poverty, health concerns, these things that like really long-term are really impacted by the colonial nature of aid and the politics of it. Like that's really where the question is most pertinent. I think in a situation where it's an immediate onset crisis, right? Like there's an earthquake, there's a war, like do we need help in 48 hours? There are systems that are not, I feel are past that point of talking about colonialism to an extent. Like within the Red Cross system, for example, the one that I know, I worked for the Red Cross, right? The American Red Cross raises lots of money, lots of money. I mean, billions of dollars a year. And so if there's an emergency, they contribute a lot of money, right? But like recently, there were floods in Brazil, for example, and the leadership is from Colombia, and there are people coming in from other countries to help because locally the local leadership was either displaced or can't handle everything, right? And so people are coming from where they need to come from, resources are coming where they need to come from. And so in that situation, I feel like the topic of colonialism is a bit, it's yes, I mean, there is a history, and yes, there is, I mean, even the Red Cross itself, it started as like, rich white people in Switzerland. So, I mean, there is that history, but the way it's impacting the field, I think there are some places where it's done better. But I also think that illustrates the questions of long-term approaches to helping the world solve
yeah,
continual crisis and continual
yeah,
entrenched problems is different than, we need to solve this immediate displacement issue. So, which
yeah.
is weird to say, right? Because that means like Gaza, like the immediate displacement is happening now. That's kind of, it's a different challenge than Palestine. Right? Palestine is a much bigger issue.
I mean, ultimately, it's about, and that applies in all contexts. It can be, political, but also humanitarian, which is two different things. So I'm just saying two different contexts. It's about teaching people how to fish, not to give them the fish. Obviously,
Yeah.
there are situations where the fish is the humanitarian aid, in kind. We have to bring actually literally the fish because some people, like the people in Palestine right now, they're trapped. They don't have any access to food. So we have to give them the means for them to survive. The next question will be, what are the challenges and benefits of embracing diversity within humanitarian teams, and how can leaders foster an inclusive environment? What can be done, and who will do it? Who will begin?
Yeah, actually, I wrote kind of a blog post about that. I've been doing a series of blog posts on the leadership qualities that I think are needed in the aid industry, and one of those is very much around inclusion, but through empathy. Actually trying to have leaders and managers who understand or try to understand the desires, interests, and needs of the people they're working with and the people they're serving as well. And yeah, I mean, and I have seen positive changes again. I mean, it's even here, like on my team over the last year, we nationalized 3 expat roles, so it's a small change, but like it's a step in the right direction. I think in terms of bringing diversity and inclusion, looking overall at who should start, I mean, it's us, it's the people who are involved right now. Like, if we want that, we have to do it.
Mm.
Um, there's a few, I mean, really concrete things that people can do, like in the hiring process, for example, just hire locally, like that's like the first step, right? If you want to have local ownership on stuff. But in terms of diversity and inclusion, I think there's an interesting, and it was in one of your other questions too, is like how do we reflect, DEI principles in humanitarian work? But I think again, the core of humanitarian work is humanitarian principles. And to understand that everything we do is rooted in humanity to begin with. And humanity is a very large group with a lot of diverse experience and a lot of interesting things they can bring to the table. So actually being empathetic to the needs of the people that you're working with and to the team and the way the world is, I think is kind of the core of it. I don't know if that answers the question or not, but
How could you describe a challenge that you have experienced when it comes to seeing, the EI being implemented? Perhaps it's the local hiring that might not be happening as effectively as it should.
I would say in one sense, from where I am, the bigger challenge overall is partnership.
Mhm.
I mean, the international agencies are not as engaged with local actors to the extent that they should. Hiring, if you have good partnerships, you don't need to hire that many people, you know? So it's again, it's a question of how you're actually approaching things. And this is something my office has worked on quite a lot. And like I don't feel that we have enough local partners either. And again, it comes back to the question on the last point on like, does an international agency need to come in and do stuff or help others do stuff, right? And that's depending on the situation, both might be needed, but I feel like over the course of the next 10, 20 years, the real important area for all of us to focus on is really empowering the local organizations that are already present, whether that's, depending on what part of the aid world you're working in, it could be a local, political organization, a local human rights organization, local humanitarian agency, church organization. Like there's any number of local partners you can work with. Which is something actually I thought was really, really amazing about the first many months, and even now on the Ukrainian escalation, right, was in the first several months, it was really just small organizations doing the work. And a lot of bigger agencies like, Save the Children, NRC, we have like media budgets, so there's a lot of media around what we do. But in most responses, it's the local church group, that is doing a lot of the work. And as we saw in the United States as well, like the Red Cross is all in its local volunteers. When you have a shelter, it's a local school that's putting people up. It's not like the Red Cross has, 6,000 buildings, right? It's got local agreements to do stuff. So it's really looking locally and helping those people who can most impact quickly.
In humanitarian work, community engagement skills are crucial for building trust, understanding local needs, and ensuring effective aid delivery. However, many organizations still prioritize hiring based on factors like educational background and previous job titles, which might not necessarily reflect an individual's ability to connect with and empathize with diversity communities. We talked about this, actually. We've been touching this topic. So the question here will be, why does this trend persist? And what steps can organizations take to better assess and value emotional intelligence and community-based skills in the hiring practices? So this is a very specific question that is very linked to what we were discussing. But the first question is why, and what can we do to improve this?
Yeah. So some of the why is just because that's how it's always been done, right? There's inertia. And again, almost every organization and every company that hires in the world like uses some of that as its basic understanding, right? You go and apply for a job at Coca-Cola, for the most part, they'll look at your college degree and stuff as well. I think that where you do see the change significantly at the local level is some of the places where people have their entry points, particularly around the volunteers that are engaged with the Red Cross, for example, or some of the more ground level, site level roles in the countries where we're working. If you're looking for people who have the right skills, colleges, like, I mean, the University of Maiduguri is a good university, but how many international recruiters know that? Very few, right? So you look at people's experience and say, okay, well, they have this experience, that's great. You look for references, people know someone, that's great. And again, I think part of the challenge really is that there are and there have been situations with personnel in the aid world where massive scandals have happened, people have been taken advantage of, communities have been exploited, like, so there's some way where there has to be a sufficient way to get someone that's trustworthy, right? And so people use common benchmarks for that. Also, part of that question that goes into like, who are you hiring? What role are you hiring for? So if you're talking about an expatriate, for example, frequently when you're hiring an expatriate, you're looking for someone with specific technical skills. And from that means you do need to know that they have, a keen understanding of marketing or, sphere standards or whatever the specific thing is going to be. So there has to be some way to technically evaluate that. And, like it or not, college degrees and training certificates is one way that happens. But yeah, I think also there is a greater understanding that things like emotional intelligence and community engagement are, valuable, right? And you do see that reflected in job descriptions. There is a push to start removing educational requirements from job descriptions, which has been kind of nice. Like I've seen that even when I started, like you would see many more things that were like, don't apply if you don't have a master's degree, And now it's like, if you have a master's degree or a bachelor's plus 5 years experience or, 10 years experience overall. So there have been some changes, but it's been pretty slow.
But actually, if I
Yeah.
may add, anyone nowadays can have a master's degree and even a doctorate as well. So it doesn't really mean much. And from my own experience, I studied human rights and international conflict resolution. And it was interesting, but I have to say, like anything else, when you learn really, it's when you are on the ground doing.
Yeah.
It's school, the street is always a school, experiences are always a school. And I think I will say this personally. I come from, a background where I actually experienced conflict because I fled Venezuela um, when I was a child.
Mhm.
And maybe one day I will tell the story. But that gave me a lot of knowledge since I was a child about justice, about inequality, about conflict itself, about many things, resilience, and being hands-on. These things you don't learn them in a master's degree, and strategic
Sure.
thinking as well. So this is where I actually will be very pleased to see those roles demanding for less master's degrees and perhaps more kind of technical knowledge, experience, lived experience as well, and create some sort of framework where this can be tested. And yeah,
Sure.
I think that's how you can maybe see quality really rather than um, titles. Because also, I know this is not a universal truth, but um, you might have a person from Harvard University or Oxford or Cambridge, but maybe you don't know if this person it's actually entering the field because of their parents or because that's what happened that was thrown at them, but they don't really mean it. And then you might see this person not being emotionally engaged to the role, or actually we might start touching colonization grounds as well because of some
Mhm.
superiority mentalities as well. I come from Harvard, I come from a high level, it might happen. I'm not saying it happens at all times, but it might happen. It's something that we do need to consider when it comes to thinking of risks. Whereas a person who comes maybe from a lower background that has had lived experiences, um, they might have other skills. They might have perhaps a more level of humility, and it's so relative, isn't it? It's not an indicator. To me, having a title is not really an indicator of humanity, really.
I would agree, and but I also think that there's
It
cultural
is.
value, and a degree from Harvard, right? Like that will always be like, "Ooh, you went to Harvard," like that's out there as part of life too. I do think that that applies less and less. Like I said, there is, and you see in a lot of organizations, an intentional effort to put people with lived experience into leadership roles in particular, so that it will impact, the layers below and above as well. Some organizations are further along in that dialogue than others, but when you look at something like International Rescue Committee, for example, most of their vice presidents are now from the regions that they're managing. Or you look at like the United Nations, where Deputy Secretary General from Nigeria, not the U.S. Like there are definitely intentional efforts to take people with that lived experience and put them into the leadership roles, right? Because I think that pit has changed. But yeah, a degree from Oxford like opens a lot of doors too. Like whether that's right or wrong, that is a true thing at the moment. So
Humanity is very complex, isn't it? Because it's
yeah.
all like when you have, it's like a cycle. I always analyze when you come from a background where you have, you will continue to have.
Mhm.
Usually, it's how it goes. When you
Yeah.
don't have, you have two options: either you keep not having, or you have to work thrice as much as the person who had to
Yeah.
get to and to be. So it's I think the solution, which is not really the solution, but I think as humans, we have to, the word accountability, self accountability, but also being accountable to one another is so important, because at the end of the day, we are humans and we're going to make mistakes. We're going to be subconsciously biased. Um,
Yeah.
and it's so important that every organization, especially humanitarian organizations, embrace the very core concept of accountability and responsibility. I might slip today, but you might actually hold me accountable for it and poke me and say, hey, that's not right. We have to step back. That's not correct. It's about accountability at the end of the day.
And again, it goes back to humanitarian principle of humanity, right? We are all human. Put that at the center of what we're doing. You touched on a really key piece that drives a lot of the discussion from my perspective, is that when you're born to privilege, privilege begets privilege, right? It continues that cycle. And so having an understanding of that. Actually, I wrote a blog post on that too. There's a really good article called The Invisible Backpack that I read in college as part of my feminist studies class. It talks to that specifically, like recognizing what you're born with and then trying to be someone who levels the playing field.
Right. So this actually leads us to the next point, where maybe we don't need to dig into deeper because we have already mentioned some points, but it's on humility. And the paragraph says some hiring managers express a belief that certain candidates are inherently superior and warrant additional support to enter the humanitarian field. This perspective raises questions about fairness, inclusivity, and the potential for bias in hiring processes. And here is the question. Why do some individuals within the sector assume the authority? This is like, why? Why do they assume the authority to categorize candidates as top? And what are the implications of this mindset for equitable and meritocratic recruitment in humanitarian organizations?
It's quite a big question.
I guess it could be linked to what we just were discussing about being humans, being inherently biased. But
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. The idea of humility or cultural humility is trying to understand, the lived experiences of those around you, right? And putting that into your consideration. In terms of people selecting candidates who are top or lower, that bias happens with everyone. It's not a question of east versus west, north versus south. Like, whoever you put in charge of hiring is going to have a bias. So having a an industry like the aid world that focuses and should be focused on humanitarian principles as the core, like that's the entry point to help people remember, like, no, we need to go about in the most effective way, the way that's going to help us, achieve what we're trying to achieve impartially, to reach the most people who need help, right? But yeah, I mean, I've worked in, it's a lot of different things that happen. You see it in Los Angeles, you see it in Jerusalem, like there's bias everywhere. So
That actually led to the question, what is a top candidate and what should happen to those? This is a question that maybe we can just pose for all the biased hiring people. What should happen to those who are just middle or bottom, aka the so-called underdogs? Because maybe they're really good, but maybe they don't come from a very top background, like we were discussing now about the cycle of privilege. Maybe these are really passionate people who are very qualified, really qualified, but they don't have the actual means to be seen as much as those privileged people are. So what is
yeah.
a top person? That's one. And two, you as a hiring person, what would you do? What would you can you actually think about what can those people who got rejected do with their lives?
Thank you with their life. Um,
If
yeah,
they
I mean,
want
again, there's like a
humanitarian,
lot of really smart people out there thinking about this topic. As Atlas Core has done a lot of really interesting leadership development work around this question of how to build out people who may not normally have access to leadership tracks. There's a guy named Bijan Nashat, who's done a lot of really interesting thinking about that as well. Should probably have him on here. In terms of how to go about it, so people who, what can they do with their lives? Like, I mean, one, getting a job anywhere is hard. So it's a matter of continuing on until you find the right spot. For people who absolutely have no access to anything, I mean, I don't know, honestly. Like, that could be a really good consulting career if you can come up with an answer to that one and help organizations figure it out. What I do as a hiring manager is I tend to take candidates and I put them into a few different buckets of like, yeah, obviously qualified, but not the qualifications I need, right? So let's consider for a different role. Someone who's like, yeah, just not interested right now, or also potentially like these are interesting with some time. They may turn into really like amazing candidates for something in the future. But you also have to realize like what I'm recruiting for, right? Like I'm a director, so I'm looking at senior management positions. I'm not looking at entry level roles. I'm not looking at like, a lot of things that most people are doing, right? Like I'm working on the people who are like holding those 10%, top paid, top management type positions. And for that, what I also do when I come across candidates who are very obviously aspiring, um, if I can very clearly see from their application, cover letter, like, if I take away from that a sense that this person really wants it, and is really going for it, and in a few years or like with another experience, they'll really start taking off. I will often write them and say, hey, just so you know, I'm not going to consider you for this job, but I would be happy to connect with you and like have, something like this, like a conversation, do an info interview, connect you to other opportunities, etc. I don't think a lot of managers do that. And I think if we made that kind of a practice for people, that would really go a long way towards helping. That's also why I started posting on LinkedIn, like particularly around helping people network. Like it's that it starts to feel personal, and some of that question sounds kind of personal, right? Like, how do you go about this? How do you like how do you get in? And it's not that people aren't qualified. It's not that people don't have shouldn't have the opportunity. It's that no one's taking the time to help them get up the chain or up the ladder or whatever you want to call it, right? I think we make that part of the expectation for managers as well, that there's going to be that feedback loop. You're going to spend part of your time reaching out, giving info interviews, mentoring other people, like helping people grow. Then that as an industry will have a huge impact on us. But there is no systematic approach to that anywhere that I've seen. So I think part of that is practical expectation too, right? Like people have a lot of work. So it's really a question of how much effort and energy can be invested into it. But
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, setting a standard and helping people understand that if you invest into making other people better, your life becomes easier, like also counts. Um, I do think part of the challenge though, and you speak globally, you know, the conversation shifts a little bit, right? You're talking like if you're talking about specifically the ability to help in an expatriate fashion on an international conflict or an international disaster is a very specific avenue to help the world. Whereas if you look locally, if you look in your own community, there's more than enough need. Everyone has an opportunity to help right where you are, you know. And I found this like when where my oldest son was born, he was born in a place called Robeson County, North Carolina, which my wife's family has a connection to the county. While we were there, I looked into the Human Development Index and just I was like, I had nothing else to do. I was taking time off to be a dad. And so I ran the county Human Development Index numbers against the international criteria. And I found that a child born in Robeson County, North Carolina, has the same outcomes in life, in general, same expectations in life as someone born in Libya, right? And so if
How
you
is
look
that?
economic indicators, life expectancy, education expectancy, like so a child born in Robeson County, North Carolina, can expect about the same as someone born in post-conflict Libya
Yes.
currently.
Yeah.
And so if you start looking like really where you are, there's always an opportunity to be humanitarian. In some
Mm.
places that maybe even easier to be a humanitarian. So
So thank you so much. Let's move on to career pathways and personal considerations. I think this is a point where many aspiring humanitarians want to actually hear from you as well. So the first question will be, can a person in their 30s become a humanitarian these days? And how much experience did all the current humanitarians have when they first joined the labor force? You kind of answer a little bit that second
mm,
part at the beginning when you mentioned that you were a volunteer and you actually were teaching English. Maybe you want to dig a little bit deeper. And how much experience do they require now that they have hiring responsibilities? Is it realistic and reasonable, and why?
yeah, so that question comes to me frequently. Like, it's probably a good one to do another like,
Yes.
post on or something. But I mean, yes, you can make a transition. I think what's important about that is that frequently people will come to me wanting to make a transition into something that they have no background in whatsoever, right? That for them, the purpose of coming to humanitarian work is to change their life, right? To do something completely unrelated to their past, to make a break. Where in reality, where you have a value added coming into our world is bringing the skills that you have, right? So like if you were working in corporate audit and risk and compliance, there is a need for that in the humanitarian world as well. So that's where you're going to be able to transition is if you follow that pathway, right? Going from that to like leading an education program, yeah, it's possible, but it will take you years. You'll have to figure out the right pathway, get the relevant skills, get the relevant experience, etc. Whereas if you're a kid coming out with an education degree, you could probably find a volunteer opportunity with an NGO that will take you down the path of working in education, right? So again, it's about being realistic in your transition and deciding how long you want your transition to take, and then lining yourself up to find the opportunity when it opens.
Can a humanitarian be a human rights activist, or should they aim for total impartiality at all costs? And this
Uh,
question, if I may give a little bit of context, comes as well as a result of what is currently happening around the world, more specifically in Palestine. Um, there are many humanitarians that have an opinion about what's happening, and they are obviously advocating for the rights of Palestinians, which is a right. It's a good thing to do, of course, but they have been targeted as well. And this is interesting because you mentioned at the very beginning that you have received in your career life death threats. There are people nowadays who are humanitarians and they are as well human rights activists. They are speaking up. They're saying we're helping here, but this cannot happen. This is not right. So, what do you think? What can you say about this in 2 minutes?
I mean, in 2 minutes, yes, the aid sector has its own biases.
Mm,
So yes, people will generally side with one part of a conflict or not, right?
mm,
You will see also, like in the UN's job is frequently to support a government, so it sides with the government. One part of the aid world that takes it very seriously to be impartial is the Red Cross Red Crescent movement. They work on both sides of the conflict, and their role internationally is to be the mediator. Um, so you will see them take a much stronger stance on not having an opinion. But yeah, I mean, most organizations will advocate for human rights to one extent or another. NRC, Norwegian Refugee Council, quite frequently focus on different human rights issues, specifically in relation to the populations that we work with. And those are not always, 100% unbiased views, right? But then also, if you take that politics into consideration, it really depends. I mean, fundamentally, international humanitarian law, international human rights law are different things. And so, in its purest sense, if you want to be a fundamental humanitarian, like, no, you should not take political side. You should advocate for people's equal access to humanitarian and, fundamental human rights. But yeah, you shouldn't have any comment on what a government is doing, as long as it's, I don't know. Yeah, it's a tricky one, but yes, you can have a stance. Most people do.
yeah. So, for example, if there were people marching now and they were humanitarians, do you think this could be an issue for their careers? If they were
Yeah.
marching for a ceasefire, for example?
For a ceasefire, generally no. So ceasefire is a humanitarian function, right? That's supported by humanitarian law, supported by humanitarian organizations. That's not a violation of humanitarian principles to say conflict must stop.
Mhm,
That is
mhm,
that is part of humanitarian action. I think yeah, but you do see frequently, and there's always reminders coming from every organization to its employees in certain situations, like, please do be careful and mindful of what you're putting on social media. I personally try not to get too deeply involved in politics, and I've lived in both Ukraine and Gaza. Like, I've worked in a lot of places that are very, very, very heavily involved in world politics at the moment. And to not post about that stuff is important. But like where I do engage is to say this specific aspect needs to be looked at, and it's fair.
Interesting.
But yeah, I think it goes with every person, and then but you see things like for example, if NRC was completely impartial when the Taliban decided that women couldn't work, NRC would have been like, oh, okay, we're not involved, right? But what NRC did was say, no, we're no longer going to deliver aid. We're not going to work under those conditions. And
Right.
so there is a fundamental level of we can accept X, Y, and Z, but not the rest of it. So
This would just be the closing remark, and it would just be about the specific skills or experiences. We already touched a little bit of on that part of the experiences. Sometimes people don't have that much experience, and yet you actually encourage them if they have the right kind of elements. But what type of skills and experiences are highly valued in the humanitarian field today, and how can aspiring aid workers develop these skills, given how saturated the volunteering field is and the financial constraints that many aspiring humanitarians might be facing? Because sometimes even for volunteering roles, you have to pay, and people might not be
yeah,
able to do that. So, how can that person break that cycle of stagnation to break in the field?
interesting. Yeah, so you kind of, I mean, you hit on it earlier a bit where you were talking about people being close to the issue can get involved, right? You might jump in and have lived experience. And so that's really valuable. Learning how to market that is going to be key to anyone's career success, right? Because it's not enough to assume that other people know.
Yeah.
It's not enough to assume that someone hiring for a job is going to know the organizations you volunteered with or the places you were at or even the conflict, that you fled from. You have to be really, really cognizant and understanding of how to sell your own story. But I think for the future, I mean, when you look at the aid industry as a whole, like that question depends on what people are, what they want to do, where they live, what part of the world they want to be involved with. But I do think overall, knowing how to tell a story is always going to be important, regardless of where technology goes, regardless of where other things go, and knowing how to tell your story of the people that you're trying to help, um, and having real empathy for that is going to take you a long way, whether you're a manager or whether you're a fundraiser or whether you're an advocate, so focusing on public communication skills, writing skills, things like that will pay off. In terms of your resume, and the NGOs in particular tend to be pretty slow in adopting new technology and new thinking, I would say. So having experience in that and knowing how to translate that into like, here are directions you can go that will help you impact the world, right? But yeah, I mean, like most NGOs still use like Excel spreadsheets and call them databases. Like we're really far behind on a lot of stuff. But I do think there are, specifics, and there are organizations that are more advanced that you can get involved with. In terms of volunteering, it's really start locally if you need to. Like you can't necessarily start as an international volunteer or with an international job, but help is what I've told people is helping Afghan, refugees in Sacramento, California, very similar to helping Afghan IDPs, in Afghanistan. So same needs.
Mm.
Yeah, again, no magical solution there, but I do think, things that tend to add value include specific geographical knowledge, right? So like you said, you fled the conflict in Venezuela, so I assume you probably speak Spanish as well, and that gives you a huge advantage if you're looking at Latin America as a potential place to work. Like I look at Latin America, my Spanish, not very good, right? Like I
Oh,
probably
bueno.
very no bueno, no hablo bueno, like muy mal. But you know, I still like I see jobs come up in different parts of Latin America, and I'm like, wow, that's really cool. So again, if you have that capacity to work somewhere, you have a value added as well. And for jobs in Latin America, you absolutely must speak Spanish. Like they're not English first, right? Just like in most of West Africa, you absolutely must speak French. So there are some very practical skills as well. It's focus on your strengths, focus on the context the stories you can tell, and the real localized skills that you bring. Like if you know the intricacies of like the Venezuelan legal system, then there are NGOs that will definitely hire you to help build partnerships. So there's these things that are really value added. Yeah, I don't know. That's also another big topic you could go on and on and on.
I'm very sure actually there will be people that will be watching this interview and they will have some questions. So this is going to be an invitation as well for those who will be viewing to post questions, because that might lead us to creating another session and to address these points that they might raise as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm
Cool.
happy to take questions. When you post it, I'll look and see if anyone wants to know stuff. I
Let's
would
do.
add here too, just to put a disclaimer, like, I don't know. I really don't know. At the end of the day, everyone's situation is unique.
Right.
Everyone's life is unique. So
Correct.
I'm happy to
Yes.
offer whatever advice I can, but everything I've said during this interview may be wrong. So there you go.
Yeah. So these are obviously your own opinions, and these come from your own experiences as well. You are not endorsing anyone's opinions. So whoever is viewing this, don't take it too hard.
Yeah.
Um, it's to help the community viewing this session today, and we are hoping that it's going to kind of create some curiosity for many, maybe hiring people as well to think of new ways to implement in their hiring processes, and not just a hiring but management in general as well, and ethos as well of the company. So thank you so much,
Yeah.
Thomas.
Thank you.
I've truly enjoyed this meeting, this discussion, and I wish you all the very best. Don't know if you want to say and add anything to conclude this dialogue.
Yeah, no, Natalia, thank you. It's a pleasure to talk, and I hope the podcast takes off and leads to a lot of success. And yeah, I mean, for anyone watching, I would, one of the things I said, there's lots of ways to be a humanitarian. You could definitely be a humanitarian where you are right now. So look
Yeah,
locally too.
yeah, I think so too. Well, thank you so much. And
Yeah.
thank you
Thank you.
everybody for viewing this conversation. Thank you.